Alright folks, Nathan here. This is my channel. Usually you see Star Wars material on the channel, but I said that at some point I would start taking a look at some other games that I enjoy, other things that I find fun, and give you some background on each of those, because I am a bit of a geek beyond just Star Wars, and maybe these are things you will find interesting as well. Star Wars, of course, right now has the Star Wars LCG, or Living Card Game, from Fantasy Flight Games, and you got Empire vs. Rebellion, which is kind of a strategy-based quasi-blackjack game. We looked at both of those here on the channel, including demo games of each. We also, of course, have Star Wars Destiny coming, which is cards and dice with a collectible model. Well, beyond the living card game model or collectible card game model is something that's become very popular lately, the so-called deck building game. A deck building game starts out with a very basic premise that every player is going to start with the exact same starting cards. Everybody starts on the ground floor, totally even. Then, as you play, you'll acquire cards that wind up going into your deck to make your deck progressively stronger. But theoretically, everybody has the same chance at those cards as you play. So you're building a deck, but rather than this being some kind of deck that you're building before you even start playing the game, as in an LCG or a CCG or a TCG, any of the collectible, trading, or living card game variants, instead, in a DBG, a deck building game, you're building as you go along. It makes it something you can basically play straight out of the box with sometimes 2 players, sometimes more, depending on which game it is that you're trying to play. And generally, if there is an expansion to buy, it's not random packs of cards. It's all the same cards in every copy of that exact same expansion that you were to buy, whether it's large or small. In that sense, it's kind of like an LCG, a living card game, in terms of the cards that you're purchasing. So this one here is one of the most basic and sort of starting level of the deck building games, and that's Star Realms by White Wizard Games. If you're looking for it in a store, that's what the box of the initial game looks like. There is an app for it. The app itself is free, though of course unlocking more content is something you do by doing microtransactions within the game itself. But then you can do basically all the different campaign missions once you've actually bought your way through with the microtransactions. The campaign is actually pretty challenging. And you'll notice this is set up for something about 20 minutes for ages 12 and up, but 2 players. That does differentiate Star Realms from many of the other deck building games in that it's only designed in the initial box for 2 players, so that it can be relatively inexpensive. So basically what you're working with here, and I've got it on a Star Realms playmat. I did buy that playmat separately. I'm a completist like that. I've got all 4 of their playmats at this point. Basically what you got is a starting hand, or a starting deck, made up of 10 cards. Most games do it like this, where you have 10 different cards or something around there that usually are disproportional between 2 different types. In this case, we have 2 main types of currency in the game. You've got trade, with those yellow coins there, and you've got combat, with the red crosshairs there, as represented by the Scout and the Viper cards in the starting deck. So both sides in this case have 8 Scouts, 2 Vipers, and start essentially at a level playing field, although, unlike many deck building games, there is a slight concession made to the fact that the first player may get a slight advantage, and the first player in Star Realms only starts with 3 cards drawn out of their 10, whereas the second player to go does get to draw all 5. After that, it's 5 cards every turn. Now, most of these games do use multiple currencies or multiple numbers to track. In this case, it's basically 3. You're keeping track of your trade and your combat, as mentioned from the deck there, but also what's referred to, okay, see it right here, as your authority. This game basically plays very much like a lot of trading card games do, very much like, say, Magic the Gathering or Shadow Era, if you've played that in physical form or on the app, where your goal is to knock out the other side. Your authority essentially represents your life. But rather than give you a whole bunch of little tokens to keep track of, this game is relatively unusual in that it gives you cards to track it. 1 on one side, 5 on the other. You have other cards that have 10 on one side, 20 on the other, and both sides start with 50. As you play a game like this and you build up your currencies, you're going to spend them on different types of cards, usually from some row of 5 or 6. In the case of Star Realms, it's 5. They call it the trade row. Now you might say, wait a second, I count a 6th one over off to the side here. This is your main trade row. Most of these games assume that sometimes you're not necessarily going to find something in the cards that have been dealt from the deck sitting off to the side, in this case it's called the trade deck, that'll fit however much you've got left of your currency. If it turns out that, oh, I've only got 2 trade, I've played, oh gosh, let's say I played 2 scouts and then somehow the rest wasn't trade, I've only got 2 trade and this costs 6 or 5 or 3 or 5 or 4, I'm screwed. No. Because there's usually an always available card, for lack of a better term, in this case called the Explorers, where essentially it's sitting out there so that in theory, as long as that deck hasn't disappeared, you can always purchase one of those cheaper ones that does you some good, just not as much good as many of the more expensive cards that you couldn't afford on that turn. So let's say that this is what our player played here on their turn. They've got 3 trade and 2 combat. In this game, what that would mean is that you could spend those 3 to acquire something from the trade row. You have a cost associated with it, so I'm going to purchase the Imperial Frigate. Imperial Frigate is going to give me target opponent discards a card and 4 combat anytime that I play it. Notice when I put those out there to be able to spend, I didn't wind up having to spend something in order to put these cards down. Deck building games don't usually have casting costs, where you have to pay an amount to be able to put out a card in the first place, like say mana in Magic the Gathering. Instead, once you've acquired them, you can play them freely, but it costs you to acquire them in the first place. Now, this game also has a feature known as allies. In essence, there are 4 different factions. You have the Star Empire, you have the Trade Federation, not to be confused with the Nemoidian Trade Federation from Star Wars. You have the Blob alien faction there. And you have the Machine Cult. A lot of these games do use factions where if you play cards of similar faction allegiances, you'll wind up getting some extra benefit. So in this case, that Imperial Frigate basically has this little symbol down here that basically says, hey, if you play something else of that same alignment, you also get 2 more combat to spend. This game also uses essentially a discard feature, where there's regular discarding and then there's scrapping. Discard goes into your discard pile, scrapping goes into what's referred to as the scrap heap, and essentially takes something out of play completely. In this case, that little trash can there notes, I hit the trash can, I can draw a card, but to do it I have to scrap my card and stick it into the scrap heap. The way these deck building games tend to work usually is you'll purchase a card, and that card immediately goes into your discard pile. Now the rationale here is pretty simple. As I make sure to replace it here, at the end of each turn, all the cards you played and the cards you chose not to play from your hand, it doesn't matter, all go into your discard pile. And you draw your hand again. If we get to the end of this character's next turn, they're going to have played these cards and discard them. Now they don't have a deck to draw from. All their face-down cards in their deck are gone. You would then shuffle your discard to create a new deck and draw your 5. So in that way, essentially, any card that you acquire isn't necessarily going to be available on that turn, but it goes into your discard that will eventually become your new deck, and progressively your game gets stronger and stronger and stronger as far as your deck building. Assuming that you're using a little bit of strategy, this is a game where the bulk of the strategy relies around basically focusing on just 1 or 2 factions as you acquire cards, so you can constantly get those ally bonuses and such by playing them. Now, I mentioned combat before. We saw trade. We saw 3 trade, being able to purchase a card from up here, which has now been replaced by the trade bot. But what about all those red symbols, all those combat symbols? Well, in this game, like I said, it's mainly like Magic the Gathering or Shadow Era or something like that, where you're trying to take out the other guy. In this case, what you would do with it, let's say we've still got those 2 combat from that example hand that I showed you. To spend that 2 combat, you're essentially just hitting the other side, and the other guy gets knocked for 2 authority. So now they're down to 48 rather than 50. And play continues back and forth until one side or the other gets knocked out, has 0 life or 0 authority, and their empire, their star realm, crumbles under the weight of your onslaught. A game like this will usually also give you a way to protect yourself and a way to play cards that don't necessarily all go directly back into your discard pile at the end of a turn. In the case of Star Realms, that's these. They're referred to as bases. And they have factions, they have costs, they have a ability, they have ally abilities as well if something else of that same faction gets out there. But they've got a health down in the corner, in this case 5. And when played, they essentially sit off to the side and are always in play with an ability you can come in and essentially activate once per turn on any given turn. Now in the case of Star Realms, there are 2 types of these. These with the gray, these go out and basically the enemy, if they can build up 5 attack or 5 combat on one turn, they can hit you and knock out your base, and your base goes into your discard pile. Or they could just take that 5 they were going to spend to knock this out and just attack you directly and hit you for 5 authority and damage you, which gets them 5 closer to winning. On the other hand, you also have some of these referred to as outposts with a black symbol off to the side. And notice these also can sometimes have those toss me on the scrap heap and get rid of me from the game basically in order to get some extra benefit type thing going on here. But in this case, the ones called outposts, these are special because kind of like in Magic the Gathering, you have those blocking creatures. What will happen is if this is sitting out here in play, I usually put it to the side, but we'll just sit it up here so we can see it. If that's sitting there with that 6 on it, I have to be able to have at least 6 before I can really do any combat, because I need to take that out before I am allowed to attack a regular base or the other player. So he's got 6 and 5, so that's 11 there. But this 5 doesn't have to be taken out. It's not an outpost. It's gray. This one's black, though. It is. So if I've got, let's say, 10 combat built up on a turn, and combat builds up very quickly with those ally abilities. You'll see some massive attacks going on, not to be confused with the band. If I've got 10 combat, I'll need to take out this for 6 before I can do anything else. I wouldn't be able to take that one on, but it doesn't matter because it's not an outpost. I don't have to attack that. I can bypass that one and attack him with those other 4 and knock him out for 4 of his authority. It's a very straightforward game, essentially constantly going back and forth, playing your cards, building trade in combat, acquiring stronger cards to put in your discard pile to eventually shuffle into your deck and use in play, hopefully gaining abilities that allow you to scrap some of these starting cards that are a little bit weaker than ones you'll acquire throughout the game, and using your combat to blast through the enemy's outposts if necessary, bases if desired, and then eventually to hammer away at the enemy until they lose all of their life or authority. Again, it's not the most intricate of deck building games at this point. There's really only 3 numbers to be keeping track of. Your authority, which is essentially your life, your trade for acquiring cards, and your combat to be able to attack the other side. You have 5 cards there in the trade row at any given time, only 1 always available card to be concerned with, in this case, the Explorer. The game itself does not come with a playmat, whether it's paper or otherwise, so you'll generally just be laying these out on a table unless you go out and buy a playmat. And I would note here that they've made Star Realms easy to expand. So let's say you want to play this as a 4-player game, or a 3-player game, or a 6-player game. What they've basically done is said, okay, we're giving you enough to play with 2 players, because that's how a lot of people like to play. That keeps the cost down. But let's say maybe you want to play with more players than that. It's very simple. Buy another box. Every box has enough for 2 players, and you can combine them together. So in theory, if I wanted to play with 4 players, I could get another box, have enough for 2 more players to have their starting decks, have enough for some more explorers to be able to accommodate the 4 players, and I'll wind up with an extra copy of each card from that deck there, which will let me theoretically play the game with those 4 players without the trade deck running out on me. I will also have enough of the authority cards to keep track of the life value of all the players involved. And when they talk about multiplayer games beyond 2 players for Star Realms, they don't leave it for later expansions to say, hey, here's how to play multiplayer. Like what the Star Wars LCG did when you had to actually buy a special expansion to get multiplayer rules initially. No, it actually comes with a regular set of rules about how to play and the factions and whatnot, but then also multiplayer rules, which includes a card list, by the way, and an advertisement for the app, that gives you multiple ways to play multiplayer. Free-for-all, Hunter, Hydra, Emperor, Raid. It's a really kind of cool way of basically taking a game that you've already played quite a bit as a 2-player game and spicing it up a little bit as you go. Now that said, let's talk about the other expansions. Beyond just buying multiple copies of the core set, what other expansions exist? And what's in them? Now, one of the things that are available, though that aren't necessary for playing the game, are the playmats. Oddly enough, the playmats are the single most expensive thing that the game has to offer. That core set is only $15, and that's before you get a discount for a lot of retailers. The playmats, meanwhile, because of what they're made of, a little bit more expensive before any discounts anywhere, basically $25. This is the Capital World playmat. This is the Battle Mech playmat. The War World playmat. And the Death World playmat. Now again, $25 for any given playmat, $15 for the core game of Star Realms. In 2015, they put out another set, also again for 2 players, called Colony Wars. Essentially, this plays by the exact same rules, it just has new cards in it. You'll track your authority with the same type cards, you have the same starting decks, you have the explorers off to the side, but your entire trade deck is essentially new cards here with some pretty powerful, interesting new abilities. Now this can be played by itself, or you can combine this with the original game. So whether you want to play as just something that has a whole lot of trade deck cards, you can play that as a 2-player game, or instead of buying multiple copies of the original game to play a 3 or 4-player game, just buy one of these. Again, this is a standalone game or can be combined. That is one really cool thing about a lot of deck building games, in that when they do come out with what are called large expansions, expansions about the same size as the original set, they can usually be played separately. So in this case, another $15 expansion here, Colony Wars. Either way is going to be a good one. I would say actually Colony Wars is probably more interesting at this point because of the choices of some of the cards that they have designed here, but both play well, and having both of them is nice to be able to combine. In 2014, they also released what's referred to as the Gambit set. Notice just a little pack here. This is $10 essentially. You got some very interesting choices of cards here. Notice they all kind of look differently from the back. They provide the Merc Cruiser, 3 copies of it. Basically, it has 5 combat, and since it's a mercenary, as you look at the card text there, you basically get to make this whatever faction you want to be able to activate those faction abilities, which is pretty cool. Only place you can find those is in the Gambit set. You also have some scenarios here. A solo challenge called Nemesis Beast, a co-op version of the same. These all have rules on how to do this special challenge scenario on the back. Solo is kind of cool because it lets you play it essentially as a solitaire game. And then solo and co-op versions of another challenge called Pirates of the Dark Star. Then you have what are referred to as Gambit cards. Now this is an interesting way of handicapping the game. A Gambit is something that you deal out a certain number to each player, and they just kind of sit off to the side, and before the game you can reveal, or you can reveal during what's referred to as your main phase. This game really only has 3 different phases of the game. Main, discard, and draw. That's another aspect I find makes this game pretty easy to learn. But essentially what you got here are cards that can either sit out and wait, and you can flip it up during your main phase, which is when you're doing all of your playing cards, acquiring cards, and pulling off your attack on the other side. And they get used, most of which get discarded to the scrap heap after use because of that icon here. But they're just really powerful cards that are essentially one-time use butt kickers. So you have these gambits, these difficult things to pull off that your forces will pull, but you can't be pulling these massive maneuvers constantly. But it's another thing to add a little bit of flavor to the game. Totally unnecessary, but more fun and flavor to the game with a new card type. Now, when I say that it can act as a handicap, you don't necessarily have to give every player the same number of these. In fact, it specifically says give them whatever amount you have agreed to. So in a game where both people are of equal skill, you might put out 5 and 5, or 2 and 2, or 1 and 1. But maybe you're playing against somebody who's less experienced. Maybe you take 1 or none, give them 2 or 3, or some other unbalanced form like that. Again, it's just a small pack here, $10, 20 cards, all of which are something brand new for the game. They also later released what's referred to as the Cosmic Gambit set for $6. Now this one is only going to have a total of 15 cards as opposed to 20. It is going to actually give you a rule update card, whereas in general these cards are going to wind up having their text, if there is anything special, down at the bottom. In many cases, not on these. But we'll see, like, for instance, that Mercenary Will and whatnot. We'll see them when we look at some of the other expansions. But in this case, you get one card called Secret Outpost. Notice it doesn't have a regular card back. It's because it actually gets created by one of the Gambit cards. But then it's just got a whole bunch of new Gambit cards. So if you liked the Gambits and you wanted to play with more of them, or you missed out on the original Gambit set, which is a little tougher to come by now than the Cosmic Gambit set, then you could pick this up and have Gambits to play with for $6 as opposed to 10. They also put out an expansion called Crisis, but to say it's an expansion is a little bit of a misnomer. It's not like one of these big boxes. Instead, for them, an expansion is a set of packs. You might think, oh god, it's blind booster packs. I hate those. I don't ever want to play a game like this. That's not what these are. These are much more like a living card game, like Fantasy Flight Games' Star Wars LCG. Every one of these has the same cards in it every time, just like these will. The difference is, instead of having to buy one giant expansion and getting all 4 types of cards, you can choose $5 for event cards, $5 for more bases and battleships, 5 for more fleets and fortresses, 5 for heroes. Pick which ones you want, pick up all of them, none of them, anything in between. So essentially, it's a buyer-friendly, keep the cost down type of way of expanding the game and allowing players to expand in the way that they want. Now, bases and battleships for Crisis. Essentially what you got here is 12 cards, just new bases, new ships. Fleets and fortresses. Again, 12 cards. And it's essentially new ships or fleets, and new bases, right? Outposts in this case, right? The little black ones that you have to go after first. That's when we start getting some new things with Crisis Events. Now, this is a new type of card. Again, 12 cards. Events look a little different, and this is where we get into the, down at the bottom, it'll tell you how to play it, so you don't need some kind of rules supplement to play it or to have to go online and figure out how. Essentially, these go into your trade deck, and whenever it gets played out, whenever it's time to switch and put a new card in to replace one that's been taken out of the trade deck because somebody acquired it or it's got scrapped, then boom, an event comes in and it happens immediately. It takes effect, and then it's gone, and a new card fills its place. It's essentially filling the role that most of these games have, which is some type of immediate effect when something not gets played by a player, but goes from the deck onto the row. In this case, the trade deck onto the trade row. But many games have this type of functionality. It wasn't built into the base game of Star Realms. It was added with the Crisis Events expansion. And then finally, so far, Crisis Heroes. Another new type of card. Again, 12 cards. A new type of card, which are the heroes. And essentially, these are cards that get played, again, so it's a purchased, played, and then can wind up sitting aside until eventually you decide to actually use their ability, which usually requires scrapping them, and they give you some pretty strong hits from that ability. So there's sort of cards that you play, but you don't have to play them immediately. You can just wait until the time is right to use them, which is something you see in some of these deck building games, but not all of them have a mechanic like this. And in this case, it's only through these hero cards. In essence, they're individuals that work kind of like bases in that they sit aside and act when you want them to, except in this case, in order to do what you want them to do, they have to essentially sacrifice themselves. It's a pretty sweet game. It's a fun, easy way to introduce somebody to deck building games, particularly if they're already into playing things like Magic the Gathering, the Star Wars LCG, and things like that. From a cost standpoint, it's really inexpensive. You can play with just one of the core sets for $15, but not counting the playmats, this entire run of all the things they've produced at this point, 2 large sets, the first Gambit set, the Cosmic Gambit set, and all 4 of the Crisis expansions, even if you don't get a discount anywhere, all you're looking at right there, again, outside of the playmats, is $66. 15, 30, 40, 46, those are 5 each, 66. There are some times where you can't even buy one starter game for that much, or just a little bit under that much. And in this case, you wind up with enough for 4 players to play and have all the expansions that already exist for the game. You toss in one playmat and you're still under $100, which is virtually unheard of in this market. Alright guys, so there you have it. One of the other games I really dig, of a type of game that I really enjoy. A deck building game, the first to get much detail on this channel, Star Realms. We'll be taking a look in the near future at sets for Ascension and its evolution in some respects, the DC deck building game, and Legendary, including Marvel Legendary Villains, Legendary Encounters Firefly, and various expansions thereof. Hopefully this has piqued your interest in a new type of game or a new game of the type that you might enjoy.